So I'm just it's back to school time. Everything is crazy. My mind is dumping entire script gardens in one early morning, and so I find myself heading back to school, and here we are. I'm flooded with things. I'm trying to get things out of my system. I didn't think I had the capacity for video, and so this is kind of one of those voice notes that I do that I yell at the mobile, and so I thought maybe I would just do it this way, and hopefully, there's not enough. Hopefully, there's enough clarity that you can hear and you can understand, and you can pull the transcript from the podcast if you need the extra help. But there's something going on right now in my life. I'm trying to create these script gardens for managing something quite heavy. Um, and so I want this to kind of serve as prologue to point you in two directions at the same time. So today we'll begin the very new series that I never intended to be a series, but we begin the series, The Absent Field, at the AutSide, and then over on Sensual Residue, we'll talk about what the field left behind. And so from that standpoint, it's kind of like the exterior analysis is happening on the outside, and how it feels from the inside is happening, and released a few minutes later on Sensual Residue. So you kind of get the inside and the outside feelings about it. Because there's something I've been trying to understand for a very long time. I can do something in one place and then apparently not somewhere else. I can have language with one person that is extraordinarily flexible, original, complicated, life, and then enter another room carrying exactly the same brain, exactly the same history, exactly the same vocabulary, and find that language becoming narrower. I can know something and I struggle to show that I know it. I can write about something with enormous precision, and then when somebody asks me to explain the same thing without warning, discover that the path to knowing, between knowing and saying, has become much harder to traverse. For most of my life, I understood these as inconsistencies. I mean, sometimes I was articulate, sometimes I was not. Sometimes I could handle complexity, and sometimes apparently I could not. Because most of the systems around me were organized around that same assumption. The capacity belongs to the person, and the performance reveals how much of that capacity the person possesses. I rarely thought to question the unit of analysis. Can she do it? That seems like such a simple question. I don't think it is, but that's where this new series, both of them, begin. And again, I should say, as I always kind of do, I didn't set out to write The Absent Field. It arrived sideways through another series I've been writing called The Architecture of Fracture, where I've been thinking about what happens to a gestalt language processing when you're experiencing a relational breakdown. So that project started with something I'd noticed in my own life. When certain relationships deteriorated, my language seemed to change with them. And because I understand my own language development through the framework of natural language acquisition, I began thinking about those changes through the NLA stages. So for anyone unfamiliar with that framework, the broad developmental movement matters here more than every technical distinction. In the earlier stages, language is carried in larger gestalts, whole units whose meaning is bound closely to the situations, experiences, voices, rhythms, and relational contexts in which they were acquired. Those gestalts become increasingly mitigated and segmented. By stage 3, words become increasingly available as transferable units. They can travel. I've written extensively now on my time being stuck in stage 3 before getting to stage 4, the decades of it. But at stage 4, something enormously consequential happens. Original grammar begins to become available. Language can increasingly be assembled rather than primarily retrieved. Stages 5 and 6 carry that generativity into increasingly complex relations between sentences, ideas, meanings, perspectives, contexts. That developmental movement has become central to how I understand my own history. And I should be precise here because the stages are not intelligence levels. There are no rankings of thought. Right? A person using earlier stage language can be carrying experience vastly more complex than the language currently available to express it. I don't experience the stages as a neat staircase that are climbed once and then left behind. Language is more conditional than that. I can't use highly generative language, obviously. You've seen Kathy and I talking to each other. She asks me a question, I answer it. You're listening to me do it right now. But I also know what it feels like when that generativity becomes less dependable. When language begins leaning more heavily upon things already built, when words remain available, but their ability to carry relationships between experiences changes. That was what the architecture of fracture allowed me to notice. I began asking a slightly strange question. What would it mean for the NLA stages to break backwards functionally? Not a regression, not a developmental regression in the simplistic sense. I'm not proposing that an adult suddenly loses decades of language development and literally becomes a stage 2 or stage 3 language processor again. No, I mean something more experiential. What happens when capacities associated with later stage language stop being dependably available? What happens when original language is still possible, but producing it becomes increasingly expensive? What happens when sentences remain, but relational complexity becomes harder to hold? What happens when words themselves remain completely intact, but what they accomplish between people stops traveling from one conversation to the next? The last question became the loose thread, and I pulled it, and the whole thing came with it. Because I realized that one of the experiences I have been describing as communication failure didn't quite behave like communication failure. I would explain something. We would talk. The other person would understand. Sometimes I had excellent evidence that they understood. Later, the relationship would behave as though the understanding never altered anything. So I would explain again. For years, I interpreted that through kind of familiar vocabulary, misunderstanding, autistic perseveration, communication differences, perhaps some version of the double empathy problem. All very useful concepts, of course, but something kept bothering me. What if the meaning had crossed? What if the problem happened afterwards? And that question is where the absent field really began. And I'm deliberately not going to tell you the answer in this recording because the series follows what happened when I tried to answer it. What I can tell you is that the NLA stages remain part of the architecture all the way through. Stage 3 becomes important because transferability matters. A word can leave a gestalt in which it was formed and still carry meaning somewhere else. That has accomplished something remarkable. It can travel between contexts. It can participate in tomorrow, carrying something learned yesterday. Stage 4 through 6 become important for another reason. They are increasingly generative. Language is not simply sitting somewhere complete, waiting to be retrieved. Something must be assembled now. For this thought, in this encounter, with this person, under these conditions. And once I started thinking seriously about that distinction, I found myself asking a question I had somehow never asked cleanly enough before. What conditions does generativity require? That question moved the series out of intimate relations very quickly. It moved into schools, assessments, clinical encounters, and unexpectedly, but perhaps inevitably, employment. During the pandemic, as some of you know, my forensic science consulting business collapsed. I had spent decades doing highly specialized work, digital and multimedia forensics, image analysis, video evidence, photogrammetry, shooting incident reconstruction. I was teaching forensic science. My work involved maths, physics, optics, evidence, testimony, and a great deal of explaining complicated things clearly enough that other people can make consequential decisions for them. Then the pandemic happened. Then I needed a job. So I applied and applied and applied. More than 200 applications. I even paid for professional help making sure every resume and cover letter was turned in, tuned to the applicant tracking system used by the particular employer. I received one interview, one. I didn't get the job. That experience has been sitting somewhere in the background of this series from the beginning. But what brought it back was watching my adult children encounter their own versions of the same machinery, autistic gestalt processors, and suddenly an abstract question about language availability while sitting at my kitchen table. There is something profoundly strange about contemporary employment. When I was young, I could walk into a place. I didn't mean hiring was fair, of course not. Discrimination existed openly, nepotism existed, bias existed. Employers made arbitrary judgments about people constantly. But for an entry-level job, there was often an actual person somewhere near the beginning. You go walk into a shop, ask whether they're hiring, fill out application, perhaps speak to a manager. My children's generation increasingly encounters software first. The resume goes into a system. The system parses it. The application may be scored or filtered. Somebody may eventually see it, or nobody may. Then, if you reach an interview, something else happens. You enter a room, physical or virtual, with strangers who know far more about the roles of the encounter than you do. They may know exactly what they're evaluating. You may know only the question. They may be scoring not only on the content of your answer, but how quickly it arrived, how confidently it was delivered, whether your face and voice carried the expected signals, whether you appeared flexible, enthusiastic, personable, spontaneous. And that brought me straight back to the NLA stages, because what kind of language does an interview ask for? Usually it asks for generative language. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about a difficult situation. Tell me about conflict. Imagine this scenario. What would you do? Why do you want to work here? Right? Take your life, locate an appropriate experience, determine which part of it answers the question, infer how much detail the stranger wants, assemble a novel response, monitor the stranger whilst you produce it, and do all of that quickly enough that the delay itself doesn't become part of what is being evaluated. That's not merely language. That is language under conditions. Suddenly, the connection to masking looked different too, because autistic people prepare for these encounters. We rehearse, we script, we anticipate questions, we prepare stories. We learn how much eye contact is expected. We learn what enthusiasm is supposed to sound like. We build answers in advance so that when the question arrives, something is already ready to retrieve. And if you've been following my work on the NLA, you can probably see why that became interesting to me. What exactly are we doing when we prepare stored language in advance for a situation that is going to demand spontaneous language later? I'll leave that question there. Because one of the pieces in this series is entirely about that. But once I saw the question, I couldn't unsee it. The series began moving between things I had previously kept in separate conceptual boxes. Gestalt language development, masking, employment interviews, autistic unemployment, assessment validity, relationship breakdown, and the strange instability of capacities everybody keeps insisting ought to belong entirely to the person. The same question kept returning. What happens between what a person can do and what becomes available under the conditions in which she's asked to demonstrate it? I think we move past that question too quickly. We see someone perform badly and immediately begin explaining the person. Anxiety, communication deficit, poor social skills, executive dysfunction, insufficient confidence, rigidity, lack of preparation, and sometimes those descriptions may be useful. But before explaining the person, I want to describe the room. Who's there? Who has the power? Who knows what is expected? Who knows how they're being evaluated? How quickly must language arrive? Can a misunderstanding be corrected? Can a question be clarified? Does the interaction have any history? Will it have a future? And then I want to ask what happens to the person when those variables change. That is where this series eventually becomes methodological. Because if changing the conditions changes what becomes observable, then we have a measurement problem. As a teacher, I see versions of this constantly. A student appears unable to do something, then I change something. Perhaps I change how the question is asked. Perhaps I stop standing there waiting for the answer. Perhaps I gave them something visual. Perhaps I let them write rather than speak. Perhaps I connect the problem to something we have already done. Perhaps I simply give them enough time that the first panic around being asked can settle. And suddenly the thing that appeared absent is present. Someone might look at that and say, oh, she can do it. Yes. But now the word can become much more interesting. This is why one distinction from my earlier work returns throughout the absent field: possible, available, dependable. Something may be possible for a person without being available in every moment. Something may be available under some conditions without becoming dependable across conditions. And if those distinctions matter, then observing a person once under one peculiar arrangement of time, relationship, sensory demand, uncertainty, and power, and tells us something narrower than we usually allow ourselves to claim. It does not mean every difficulty is environmental, and it certainly does not mean autism disappears when everybody becomes sufficiently accommodating. No. And it does not mean every autistic person secretly possesses every capacity in society, merely refuses to reveal it. I'm not interested in replacing one simplistic explanation with another. I'm interested in the relation, the person and the condition, capacity and availability, language and the circumstances under which language is being asked to become. That's why I've called this series The Absent Field. And I'm not going to define that phrase yet. You'll know what it means soon enough. But I will tell you that once I had the phrase, several things that had been sitting separately in my thinking suddenly belonged to the same landscape. And that is usually when I know I need to write. There's also one other reason I wanted to make this prologue as a conversation rather than simply publishing another essay. I needed to hear myself say all of this out loud. The series became a script garden for me. I did not have the language for the conversation I needed to have in my own house. I could see the pieces of what was happening. I knew my own history. I knew what my children were encountering. I knew the employment statistics people repeat. I knew the literature around autistic communication. I knew what my own language development had taught me about stored language, transferability, generativity, availability, dependability. But knowing all of those things separately did not give me the conversation. So because it's the end of the summer holiday and I have a few minutes, my lunch, to follow the thought properly, the end of the summer holiday, having time to write, I wrote the pieces until they began belonging to one another. And that's what these essays are, the ones on the outside, the ones on sensual residue. They're not a promise that I've solved autistic employment, and they're certainly not another program for teaching autistic people how to interview better or optimize the right resume or disclose the right way and mask more convincingly or find a coach who finally knows the secret route through the machinery. I'm deeply suspicious of that promise. There is an enormous amount of money to be made telling people standing outside a locked door that they simply have not yet learned to knock correctly yet. I'm not interested in the door. I'm interested in what happens to language before we reach it, whilst we're standing in front of it, and after it closes. Because perhaps the question was never simply, can she do it? Perhaps there's another question we should have been asking alongside it. Under what conditions does what she can do become available? That is where the absent field begins, with natural language acquisition, the framework certainly, with gestalt processing, with relationships, with employment, with assessment, with my own history, and now painfully, with parts of my children's. But underneath all of those is the same question. What happens when we stop treating the conditions surrounding autistic capacity as empty space? I followed that question. The series is what I found.